self, their country love, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine till all success be nobleness and every gain divine. When I was in
Okay.
school,
So,
we used to sing something like this. Oh,
so Professor,
beautiful,
I listened to this
oh,
earlier
spacious
this
sky,
morning, and it tears to my eyes is a little
forever
melodramatic, but I choked
waves
up.
of grace.
And then I listened to another version with a bunch of children singing it. I think like a Minnesota children's choir. And both versions and all versions are just, this is my favorite holiday coming up. And if this was Sunday, July 4th, I wouldn't want to talk about anything negative at all about America. I just think we should pause once in a while to celebrate where we were and how much farther we've come and what we still have to accomplish. I just love the 4th of July and Independence Day. And I'm painfully aware now that there's people that don't have that same feeling. So we'll talk about that some today. But can you, and then we'll do a bio in a second. Can you give some overview? I love America and Independence Day and the 4th of July. I just love everything about it. How about you?
Same. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's my favorite holiday because it does bring out, I love my neighborhood. I love my neighbors. And I love the, when it brings everybody out of their homes and back and in their front yards, and we're all, which we do a lot anyway. I was hanging out with all my neighbors this morning, but it, it, you know it, it just reminds you of the power of the ideals to create such a good life. And in a way, it's also still very community based and very city based. You're every small town in America has some kind of fireworks display, and it also is a thing that creates memories for kids. Almost every kid has some kind of a memory of what their family did for the 4th of July. So I think of Thanksgiving this way too. But I would say that in many ways, Easter, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving are kind of my favorite of the three holidays.
So we're peas in a pod. From earliest memories of fireworks to actually just anticipation of this year. And I know America's got problems. I point them out sometimes on Facebook. I'm just completely entranced with the opportunity, the future, the hope that America can provide to ourselves and our posterity and to the world. And so let's talk about that a little bit today. But I guess if this is somebody's first show, we should at least tell them you are. I'm John Brackney. I'm a Colorado native and a political science degree and a kind of a professional in that field and a law degree. And that's enough about me. But you should go a little bit further, Professor. You're in California, but who are you?
My name is Stephen Tootle. I'm a history professor at the College of Sequoias. I also teach out at the at Ashland University in their Master's in History and Government program, and occasionally write for various publications, usually book reviews because I'm lazy and I like books.
Well, and you also had one in National Review. You just came out, right?
This week. So go to your closest newsstand and pick up National Review and read my review of a biography of Thaddeus Stevens that it's in this week's National Review.
Yeah, very nice. The professor and I met at the American Enterprise Institute under a leader who's now at Harvard, but Arthur Brooks, who was the former CEO. And this topic, Professor, reminds me of both of you because he's not shy about pointing out deficiencies. Poverty is one of his major things he'd like to help solve. But he's not shy. He's not idyllic and not attuned to the world, and neither are you. But you're both crazy optimists or believers in the human spirit or problem solvers, and you study history, which seems to be pretty brutal. And so, but having said that, I just admire you both dearly, and this is, I think, our 23rd show. But maybe I'm off. I should add it up someday. If you like it, please look at Tootle Talks, everyone. If you miss a show and would like to understand history or meaning of words or the meaning of military or abortion is coming up or gay rights, we're taking a variety of topics. So, Professor, I have been a self-described patriot. And now maybe somebody who disagrees with me on this, that, or the other thing would disagree here and then. And usually they're just being rude. But I think if anyone were to look at my bio from Boy Scouts to military to elected service to public service, etc., I love being a patriot. I think that's all positive. From the founding of our country in 1776 to this second, I think being patriotic is a good and noble thing. Why don't you give us your perspective on patriotism?
Well, I think that patriotism in the American context is different than patriotism in almost any other context. Because as far as an American is concerned, patriotism, and I would also say conservatism, can really only have one definition. What you have to remember about the American experience is that the United States of America was founded as an ideological nation state, the first in the world. And break that down into its three parts: ideological nation state. And ideological, big word, just means ideas. And then nation just means people, and state just means government. And so we were founded on the basis that we are the ideas people government. Or to say it another way, we are a group of people who are organizing a government around these ideas. So does that make sense? If I say ideological nation state, it's just a way of saying that our government is founded as we are the group of people who are instituting a government on the basis of these ideas. And because of that, and there are two essays that I think are really instructive and important that I always make reference to, and you can look at them later. One is Calvin Coolidge's speech on the anniversary of the 4th of July, which Tony will put in the chat, a link to it. And the other is an essay by a great guy by the name of Peter Schramm, who passed away a few years ago. But he was just the most American you'll ever meet, Hungarian immigrant to the United States. But he wrote this essay called Born American, but in the Wrong Place. And in this essay, he describes how he immigrated to the United States with his family. And in that essay, what happens is he's in Hungary, and his dad tells them that they have to move to the United States. And he asked his dad, why do we have to move to the United States? And his dad says, because, son, we were born American, just in the wrong place. And that's a man who understood that the United States of America is an ideological nation state, a place where these are the people who have organized their government around a set of ideas. And so that's why I say patriotism can have only one definition, and conservatism can really only have one definition. If you want to call yourself an American patriot, it means that you are adhering to a certain set of ideals. Now, you mentioned that book review that I just wrote, and I saw in the comments on the National Review website, somebody had written, this kind of criticism of it. And one of the things they criticized was a quote that a paraphrase from that Coolidge speech, actually, but I'm sure this person didn't know it was a paraphrase of the Coolidge speech. but it's a very common criticism that people make. They say, well, yeah, we have these ideals, but what about slavery and killing Indians and the Constitution, you name it. And that's none of the times when human beings failed to live up to the ideals, it undermines the ideals themselves. And I'm just going to do something we almost never do, but I want to read you a paragraph from the Calvin Coolidge speech that is maybe the most important paragraph in terms of understanding the American founding and maybe understanding my own political philosophy. But this is what
Perfect.
Coolidge said. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. And I've always loved that, meaning, you can exhale, right? It's exceedingly restful. It's often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776. And remember, he was writing this in the 1920s as a response to progressivism of the 1920s. So he was addressing his comments towards people who say, oh, we need to make progress beyond the founding ideals. And he was saying, people will say we've made a great deal of progress, that we've had new thoughts and new experiences, which have given us a great advance over the people of that day. And we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. Don't we hear people say this all the time? But here's what Coolidge says: but that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. And the next few sentences are foundational. And to me, what I'm about to say is the definition of patriotism, and it is the definition of the United States. So if you want to claim to be patriotic, here's what you must believe. And anybody who doesn't believe this stuff is not patriotic. So if you want to celebrate the 4th of July, if you want to celebrate America, this is what you must believe, according to me and Calvin Coolidge. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the government, from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward to the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary, and their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. Now, I hear people all the time say, I just heard in a Supreme Court decision yesterday, we had 3 Supreme Court justices who said, oh no, we have a more modern idea. And 6 justices said, no, we're going to stick with, the understanding of the Constitution we have. But my point is this: when we get to some of the criticisms of the United States and the founding, when somebody is protesting and says, well, I want to protest against the flag, or I don't want to hear the national anthem, it's because someone has lied to them about what this country means. And that's a shame, and it's sad, but somebody has lied to you about what this country means if you think it means something other than what Coolidge just said. Inalienable rights, all men created equal, consent to the governed. And those are maximalist propositions. So we shouldn't be shocked when human beings act like human beings and do what human beings have always done. Human beings have always engaged in racism. Human beings have always engaged in sexism. Human beings have always, the strongest and most violent human beings have always tried to impose their will. What we celebrate when we celebrate the 4th of July is the ideals that undid those things. And so, my definition of patriotism is anyone who's acting in accordance with those ideals. And anyone who is not doing that stuff is not a patriot.
Yeah, so Professor, that's very similar to a thing that the Googleplex told me about today that I don't remember reading, which is it's something called the American Creed, not an American Creed. There's two different ones. And it was adopted by Congress in somewhere right around 1918 or 1919. Very similar to President Coolidge's thoughts. So you're familiar with that?
I'm not, but it sounds.
Tony, if you can dig that up and put that in the notes as well, I'd appreciate it. The thing I thought was remarkable about that and your comments is it goes right back to the Declaration of Independence. It's not like a new thing that we have to debate about today or 20 or 10 years ago or 50 or 100 years ago. It goes back to our very founding of our country. Now, let me ask a caveat question though, and you can take it either answer. I think it's probably a majority of my friends say, yeah, America's pretty good. I like it. I mean, I've made a living here and a life and a family and it's good. But I also, God, I love France or Eastern Europe or Indonesia. I mean, gosh, Vietnam's cool. And South America, have you been to, and it's almost an equivalence, which I get, by the way. I've been to 22 countries. I love a lot of countries and its people, but they kind of take us all as equal. I'm patriotic American if they are, and just as an Austrian or Englishman or anybody else would be. But you're saying it's, well, historically it may not, but currently it could be. Talk to us a little bit about in comparison to other countries today.
Well, the ideals of America have spread throughout the world. So, and I would also include England in this because they had in many ways a kind of parallel track to the United States and in the development of their legal codes and their understanding of individual rights and stuff. So, I'm not an English historian or English constitutional lawyer, but it is my understanding that in many ways there was a transatlantic conversation going on in the legal realm regarding rights. And so a lot of these ideals about rights were in many ways kind of adopted in England and the Commonwealth 40 or 50 years, after the United States in many cases. So, that, I enjoy other countries too. And this has nothing, to me, it has nothing to do with, saying that other countries are not fantastic. Other countries are fantastic too. And to the extent that other countries believe in individual liberty and the consent of the governed and equality for all citizens, like it's great. We should celebrate that as well. I don't have any sort of negative feelings about other countries. And I guess that gets to the next question that people will sometimes ask it, or maybe we should just let you ask it because
no, please keep going.
Yeah, the question of like, what is nationalism? And nationalism is simply, to me, it's like American patriotism minus the ideas, just that sort of circling the wagons reactionary feeling that we have where we want to celebrate whoever we're a part of, In other words, rooting for the home team because it's your home team, not because they are particularly good or, you agree with their ideals. What makes America unique is the fact that we're an ideological nation state. The fact that people feel a sort of circle the wagons nationalism mentality, that's universal. To me, that's something that we don't necessarily, I don't celebrate nationalism. That's just something that's hardwired into your brain. So I don't find anything particularly, amazing or wonderful.
So Professor, I had and you may not be familiar with this debate. There was a gentleman who wrote a book on nationalism, and a colleague of our mutual acquaintances of ours, I think, Alex wrote a comment on it. So I happened to read a little bit up on it and watched an hour-long interview with him about his new book. And it was some interesting points that did resonate with me, that if it wasn't for nationalism, the 13 colonies coming together to make it strong enough to defend those rights, that really the danger by not believing in nationalism allows for authoritarian or anarchy to rule, and that you need a nation state in order to protect those values of its people. And there were, I guess I'd take a little bit of umbrage saying there's no ideas, patriotism minus the ideas, that without the enough critical mass of people to protect those values, your values are worthless because somebody's going to either destroy them somehow. A reaction to that, and I'm sorry not to give you the author.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I would just simply say that that there were a lot of bad books written about nationalism in the last 5 years, both defending it and attacking it in silly ways, or I wouldn't say silly ways, but just ways that were overly politicized and informed by current politics. There's a very simple answer that proves that I'm right, which is, the British had 37 colonies in the New World and 50 something in the Western Hemisphere. They didn't all break away to form the United States of America. So just let that reality sink in there for a second. And what it should tell you is that no, there were 13 colonies out of this mess of British colonies that had a set of ideas in common. And let's go back to the Declaration and discuss this for a second, because every single colony had a veto power over the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson said that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, that was meant to be the common sense of the subject, written in language that was so plain and firm as to command assent, meaning these are the ideals that we all believe in, because there was an original draft of it that contained very harsh language about slavery, and 12 of the 13 colonies were fine with it. But he took it out because one colony thought it was too harsh. But what that should also tell you is that the other 12 colonies agreed with his very harsh rhetoric about slavery. And it also tells you that our founders did consider Black people to be human beings and men, and they did mean, when they said all men are created equal, they did mean Black people, they did mean Indians, they did mean women, all of that stuff. That they meant every human being, and they included those people as human beings as entitled to rights. But one colony objected to the language of slavery, so it was taken out. And you can also look up the original draft of the Declaration and then, of course, the final draft and see the difference. But what that should tell you is two things. Number one, 12 out of 13 were on board with the condemnation of slavery and, making it clear that Black people were human beings and men in the all men are created equal. And the 13th was too. They objected to the harshness of the language. Yeah, thank you for posting that, the original draft. So, but that should also tell you that when Jefferson was writing about the Declaration later and saying, no, this is the common sense of the subject. This is just the stuff that we all agree on, and it's the stuff that only we agree on. So that alone tells you that most of the discussions about nationalism are based on a false premise, because that's what actually happened during the founding of this country. Is we were founded explicitly as an ideological nation state. Really let that sink in. These are the people who believe these things, and these are all the people who believe these things. So if you believe these things, you need to move to the United States of America. And if you don't believe in these things, then you live somewhere else. So we were only the collection of people who believe these things, or who were willing to go along with it. Now, what did that mean in terms of the population? It was really about a third of the population. But the other third was sympathetic with the crown, and most people are just kind of waiting to see who wins. But there was a tremendous outmigration. That's the other thing that people always forget, is like after the country was founded, a bunch of people left. Because
American freedom, American slavery, I just read that chapter this morning. It said 20% of people and went back to England. They were
Yeah.
okay. So, Professor, a couple more questions before we open it up to folks. You're alluding to it in several different ways, but I think you have a nuance to this. I've been proud to be an American my whole life, so maybe that's some version of privilege or something. But I just really feel fortunate that that I was born here. It wasn't much talent to be born here, but I did it, and I'm here. And so when I travel around the world, I hope not to be the ugly American, but I do think that it's a pretty special place. And so talk a little bit about American exceptionalism and the good part, if any of that, which I think there is, but also maybe there's some negative part of being believing in American exceptionalism. So will you chat a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, I just, there are two interesting points I think you brought up. One is pride, and the other is American exceptionalism. So I'll take pride first, and then remind me to come back to American exceptionalism. The first thing is I would say is I'm a Calvinist. I don't believe that I should have pride in anything. Like, first of all, I should never have pride in something that somebody else did. And second of all, I shouldn't have pride in anything I did, because that means that I'm going to hell. So for those two reasons, I think of the American experience as something that is the result of grace and luck. You know, I was lucky to be born here. Through some unknowable combination of grace and luck. You know, the line from America the Beautiful, that, you know, it's really what we get is somebody, we are the beneficiaries of people who believed that kindness towards future generations was more important than their own lives. And there is nothing we could do in our own lives to deserve that, the sacrifices that were made on our behalf. And all I can do is try to appreciate it. So that's how I sort of answer the pride part of the question. But then the American exceptionalism part is also somewhat, it's another one of these terms that has just been turned into something ugly and weird. Now people think, and again, I'm sorry if you, I'm sorry, it's sad that everybody gets this wrong, but I'm right about this. Like, American exceptionalism, read Federalist 1, because Alexander Hamilton explains in Federalist 1 what American exceptionalism is. And Washington's farewell address, which was written by Alexander Hamilton, explains what American exceptionalism is. American exceptionalism is not the idea that America is better than every place else. That's not what it means. American exceptionalism is actually about the burden, the responsibility, and what Hamilton says is that in Federalist 1, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but he says, we're here to decide the important question. There's one important question in all of human history, in all of human interaction. And that is, we're here to settle the question, can human beings govern themselves peacefully? Is that possible? Because it's never happened before. And so we have a different purpose than every other country that has ever come before us, and every other country that comes along. If they want to do this with us, great. We're happy that New Zealand believes in this stuff too now. But there is a special burden that the United States has, because we were founded in an experiment. Can human beings live together and govern themselves? Or will we devolve into what every other experiment like this has devolved into accident and force? Every other group of human beings in all of human history was ruled by someone else who was in charge because of either violence or accident. Why is this person in charge? They're somebody's son. Why is that? Why are we choosing that guy's son? Because his father or grandfather was the most violent person. And that is how all human large organizations, larger than 150 people, right? You can have a social organization up to 150 people without You can have a commune of 150 people, but you can't have a nation that will stand up to the Nazi war machine. Uh, and that's a question in all of human history. So American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States has a different role to play in human history. And that role that we must play is we must preserve representative government here. So in a way, people think of American exceptionalism as something that has to do with foreign policy. But in a way, it's a reminder that our most important foreign policy obligation is actually something that we must do domestically. So the most important thing that we do for the rest of the world is preserve representative government here as an example that it can work. Because we saw what happened just in this last year. If it looks to the rest of the world like our government is a joke, or that representative government is failing, strongmen around the world will simply say to the people who they govern, see there, look, you don't want to be like them. They're just, that government is just a sham anyway. They don't have self-government there. And what I find, disturbing is how often I hear racists, Stalinists, communists, fascists, neo-fascists, criminal organizations, and strongmen dictator all saying exactly the same thing, which is we should reject the Declaration of Independence because it doesn't work. You can't have a government based on what Coolidge said. You can't have a government based on consent of the governed and individual rights and all men are created equal. You just can't. And we're here to prove that you can. Now, what people don't like is if you want to preserve the consent of the governed, well, what about racists? And you're like, yeah, we have to preserve their rights too.
So Professor, that's my final question before we open it up to anybody that has a question. We started the show with just like tremendous love of country. I, with all our flaws, it's a pretty brilliant place. I'm just so thankful. But there are just horrible things that we've done as a nation state and individuals within the nation state. It's just, and if I was a black John Brackney or a American Indian or indigenous John Brackney instead of a couple hundred years ago white John Brackney now today, I might have a different view of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution until the amendments came by. But even after the amendments, maybe it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1965, it's been a long time coming, and maybe I'd have a different view of America. So if this was the 4th of July 2 days from now, I don't even want to bring up something negative because I just really want to be all positive. But I do think we should be realistic about our history and where we're coming and where we're going. So do you have a reaction to my concern that some of my friends, they won't like this conversation? They'll think it's BS. They think, well, no, we're still a pretty bad country, and until it's fixed, they ain't going to celebrate. Can you give some kind of reaction to that?
Well, just say we celebrate the ideals, not the failings. It's like saying, I'm trying to think of an analogy where you just say like, because sinners go to church, that you stop believing in the church. No, that's not the point. The failures of human beings when human beings act like human beings is not a valid criticism of the ideals. And we should also maybe understand that preserving the rights of others is always going to be an imperfect process, because we are trying to, the rights of the individual while preserving the will of the majority, those are in conflict with one another. And what we're committed to is working those things out peacefully. Now, if you happen to be, one thing people will sometimes say is, say, well, what, you need to educate yourself. Read Frederick Douglass's What is the 4th of July, and I'll simply say, you need to educate yourself. Read his later speeches where he says he was wrong. That, you need to keep reading Frederick Douglass. Don't stop reading Frederick Douglass. Keep reading Frederick Douglass, because what he comes to understand is that Lincoln was right. That his argument was that the way to understand the Constitution is to understand that the Constitution enacts the ideals of the Declaration. And you can say, you know what? The Constitution, and this is true, by the way, this is, when during the ratification debates, there were people who wanted the Constitution ratified who went back to the Southern states and said, hey, look, South, this Constitution protects slavery. And people took that same Constitution to the North and said, hey, look, North, this Constitution doesn't recognize slavery, and it's going to do away with slavery. And what I'm telling you is that the North was right. That the United States of America, and you don't have to wait. In some ways, you could say, if I was a lawyer, I guess, you could say that the amendments settled the ambiguity, but before the Civil War, what was being worked out in the courts in the North was the legal understanding that you don't actually need those amendments. The amendments were there to sort of bring the country together and settle the issue, because the argument of the Democrats was it's not in the Constitution. And the argument of the Republicans is like, it doesn't need to be, it's in the Declaration, and we understand that the Constitution is there to enact the ideals of the Declaration, and the Declaration says all men are created equal. And if you don't believe that's true, here's another document you can look up. There's a great criticism of Lincoln at Gettysburg written by the Chicago newspaper at the time, and that's the one, I think I've mentioned it before on a previous episode, where they say, look at Lincoln, he's so dumb, he calls the founding 1776. And it was a criticism of the Gettysburg Address. And the criticism was, we don't think about this now, but it was controversial when Lincoln said 7 years ago, because 7 years ago was 1776, and only Republicans dated the founding to 1776. And think about this: the 4th of July was sort of seen as a partisan holiday during the Civil War, because it became a political issue, because Democrats were saying, who cares? Who cares about the 4th of July, right? Like, ignore the Declaration of Independence. That's just a piece of paper, but it was the rest of the people of the United States who were saying, no, we understand the legal relationship between the Constitution and the Declaration, as the Constitution is there to put the Declaration into place. So, I mean, there is a line, kind of one line in the preamble that people say was meant to incorporate the Declaration in there. But you're right. The 14th Amendment is what makes it explicit. It says, fine, you want to argue this, we want to argue that. Let's settle this for all time, and we're going to put the principles of the Declaration into the Constitution to sort of settle the argument. But America, as Americans understood it, outside of the South, that is, was that the purpose of the Constitution was to enact the ideals of the Declaration.
Okay, let's end our conversation with that and open it up to Q&A from whoever joined us. Now, Holly, I'm going to give you a privilege of unmuting yourself if you have a question. If not, that's fine. Don't unmute yourself. We're going to go to Jake or Anthony. Holly, you're up if you have a question. We'll go back to you if you do. Jake, you up, or Tony, what do you think?
I really, every time, appreciate what's being said here, because it is absolutely contrary to everything I was taught, especially thinking more because we had talked about this a little bit, like you definitely, Professor Tootle would be considered conservative in nature, but the ideals you're kind of espousing and talking about relative to history, I had no idea. I had no idea that was because those are things I agree with, and so I think that's one of the things that I love about. We were talking about this a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. Wasn't that, hey, everything's settled? It's that we're committing to continuing to govern ourselves, which
in a peaceful way.
Say it again.
Peacefully.
And peacefully, yes. Which is and it's interesting because I was thinking about it. It's been very peaceful. I mean, extremely peaceful comparatively. And having traveled to another country just recently in Latin America, and just kind of seeing, there's excellent things about it, but just hearing their form of government and how it's happening, and that hasn't been peaceful, for them, historically, and they look to us as as an example, of course, so it was super helpful for me, because I think I on occasion get too critical without seeing, hey, we're doing a really good job too, like, yes, I want things to get better. But so I appreciate that. That's more a comment than a question, but just,
Well, let me ask a question off your comment, and then we'll go to Jake or Holly. Professor, I'm surprised that a ton of my conservative friends, I've been a lifelong conservative, kind of think I've gone off the deep end of being liberal because I'm spending time on caring about blacks or gays or some women's issue. I mean, all sorts of stuff. And I still kind of think it's pretty conservative. And I'm hoping that it's actually kind of a roadmap to say, hey, listen, don't you want to govern? And it's not being liberal. I think it may be kind. Maybe it's a little mushy just because I want to be nice. But I think it's actually more conservative than it is liberal. So I don't mean to steal your thunder, Tony, but I kind of think all men are created equal, men and women and gays, lesbians, and so on. No, it's actually in the Declaration of Independence, and it's in the Constitution that need to be affirmed, but it's a conservative notion, not a liberal. And I don't mean to take us into the politics on the 4th of July, but do you have a response to that?
No, you're right, and your friends are wrong. When you care about the principles that are in the Declaration, you're either a conservative or you're a liberal. And if you reject the principles of the Declaration, then you're something else. And you're actually advocating for something more ancient than that of the Revolutionary Fathers. And I would say one of the things that has been, I guess, perplexing to me is, here's Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s saying, you're not a conservative, you're a reactionary. Understanding that the opposite of a conservative is someone who's a reactionary. And a lot of the people today who call themselves conservatives they're reactionaries. They're just against something that they don't like. And when I would simply say, like, when you stand up for the individual rights of someone who is experiencing an injustice, you are being an American patriot, and you are being more conservative than liberal. Because the distinction between a liberal and a conservative is, a liberal is supposed to believe in individual liberty and the consent of the governed, but what you're supposed to care about more, if you're a liberal, is you're supposed to care about more about the consent of the governed and less about the individual liberty. But you're still supposed to care about both, but it's supposed to be 51-49, and then if you're a liberal, it's 49-51. But when you see someone who is experiencing an injustice, someone who is not experiencing the blessings of liberty, when you stand up for that person, you're engaged in an act of radicalism that's as radical as the American Revolution, but that makes you an American conservative.
Fascinating. And folks, friends, I don't mean to take us into politics per se. I'd rather talk about history and our founding and where we are, but thank you for that, Professor. Okay, so take yourself off mute and I'll call on you. Holly, you ready to ask a question?
Hi, John. Yeah, I thank you for letting me join all of this. I've seen you doing this for a while, and I've kind of been curious, as to what it is, and I just wanted to find out more of, this new, what I think is kind of new phenomenon of some people not liking patriotism or patriots or the 4th of July or flags, or being just kind of anti all of that lately. So, and a lot of people that I know and I like. So I don't know, that's troubling to me. And I just would love to know your thoughts on, how to connect with these people, and, are they right? Are they wrong? And how did this just start happening?
Yeah,
A year
Professor, I
or
think
so
that's
ago.
enough for you to grab onto. What do you think, Professor?
Well, it didn't just start happening. People have been lying about the founding of this country since it was founded. And, and from the time of the founding, there were people, slave owners, who were there telling essentially an alternate view of the American experience. And there are people, racists, who have been trying to make a racist argument about how America should be a racist country and how America is and always has been a racist country. But I will say that for me, who I always consider myself an American conservative, when the Black Lives Matter, or I was thinking initially of like Colin Kaepernick kneeling. I remember telling one of my classes when it came up in class, I was thinking, well, this is strange. The racist is the one who's waving the flag, and Colin Kaepernick is protesting the flag. And what I would do if I had these two people in a room is I would say, hold on, you're the one who should be kneeling, and you're the one who should be saluting. Because if you're saying that what we want is everyone in America to experience the fullness of their political rights, then you're the one who is saluting the flag. And if you're somebody who believes that we should be not caring about an injustice that is taking place, you have no business waving the flag. You're not an American, you're not a patriot. And that's why, when things like so-called Confederate monuments, all of those controversies, I didn't really have to hesitate when people ask me what I thought about that stuff. I don't know, why would you put up a monument to a traitor? Like, why would you put up a monument to racism? Like, I would also kind of blame in a way, the inherent goodness and moderation, where we sometimes believe that the truth is not black and white, so it's gray, or the truth is found between two extremes. And in some issues, that's just simply not true. As Coolidge said, there are not too many of these in American politics, but there are a handful of principles, and they are final. So there are some things in American politics that are non-negotiable, or I should say are only negotiable between themselves, like, consent of the governed versus individual liberties. In other words, yeah, you negotiate these two things between the two of them, but you don't get to reject any of them. And when Southerners would make the case, yeah, but what about racism? I'm sorry, that's one that's non-negotiable. You can say, I'm a racist and I want to have my right to vote. You say, absolutely, we will protect your right to vote, but we won't protect your right to enact racism. That one is non-negotiable. So I would simply say that, the fact that we call it a civil war, for instance, was us trying to be nice to the South. Nobody called it the civil. Lincoln used the term sometimes, but legally speaking, it was a rebellion. and there was no legal status for the so-called Confederacy, for instance. And yet now when you pull up a map, it'll have, here's the Union and here's the Confederacy. Well, in a way, you could say the South won because they got us to acknowledge their legal interpretation of the Civil War. Because we all, when we think of the Union, think of the North. And the reason they were calling it the Union was precisely to emphasize that it was the entire United States of America, not just the North. And the United States of America never recognized that there was a thing called the Confederacy. And neither did any other country on earth. So the fact that if I go across the street to my classroom and pull down a map that there says the Union on the top and the Confederacy on the bottom, that's a pro-Southern interpretation of the Civil War. And they managed to sneak that stuff in throughout, and so I just say, remember that when you think about all of the easy answers you've given about American history, just how many times, without even thinking about it, we've accepted the racist Southern version because they never stop. They never stop pushing their narrative, ever. So, that's why it's so important, especially on times like the 4th of July, that we need to remember that they're wrong. And we need to say that, and we need to be plain about it. Referring to our past and referring to our founding documents, like, we're right. And Coolidge even said in another speech, just to really plug Coolidge, Coolidge said that what we should be, again, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, our principles are based on the true nature of the human experience. And that's why we should never be afraid of the truth. Because every act of telling the truth in context is its own act of patriotism. If you're telling the truth about America, you're engaged in an act of patriotism. And we should never fear the truth. The truth is, in order to be the truth, it must always be in context. But we should never fear the telling of the truth in context, because that telling the truth in context is always an act of patriotism.
Thanks, Professor. Holly, thanks so much for joining us. I think this is our 23rd, and we do it every Friday. Appreciate you finally deciding to jump in. They're all available on Toodle Talks, by the way, on YouTube. So if you'd like to see some other ones on other talks, please just look them up. Frank, you're up.
So to carry on this incredibly important responsibility of proving that a representative government can exist in the world, the country has to continue to exist. And I feel we're running on the dangerous edge of undermining some of the most important principles that we have. Peace, AKA free enterprise. I believe that's, we have this situation, it seems, where we're undermining the ability for free enterprise to continue. We overtax. We have presumably a majority of people who are voting to increase taxes, to transfer wealth to the other part of the country. And if you undermine the integrity of the free enterprise system, so it doesn't make any sense to have businesses going, because you're taxed to the point that you can't continue to run the business, then you no longer have a country to govern. I mean, there's nothing there. You got, so is that a fundamental flaw in the system? where the majority starts telling the minority who's being productive, you don't get to keep any of it.
Well, yes, and it's not new. So I'll answer. There's two parts to this that I think are important. Number one is that ignorance will always result in human nature reasserting itself. So in the absence of the political culture that believes in preserving the rights of unpopular minorities, what will always reassert itself is this idea that I want to take something away from somebody else and give it to myself. And the reason we have a constitution is because under the Articles of Confederation, that's exactly what Americans were doing. So right after the revolution, the first thing that happened was we had too much democracy. And all the things that you're describing, nullification of laws, the nullification of contract laws, abrogation of debt. If you go back through the Federalist, you can see that the reason we needed a second constitution was because we had way too much democracy. And there were a lot of people, even during the founding, who didn't believe in our constitution precisely because it eliminated so much democracy. And so those people are all Americans, and we say they're all patriotic Americans, but they have been trying to undermine the Constitution since it was ratified. You know, there were people at the time who voted against it because they wanted more democracy and they wanted to do away with individual rights. So, I mean, part one is to say that if we default to ignorance, we should assume that human nature will reassert itself. And number two, we have already done this, so it's not new. You know, people say like, well, you know, isn't it a shame that human beings will do this? Like, no, we've tried it many times before. I don't know why people keep thinking that this is a new experiment or that this isn't what people will do. This is what people will always do. It's in Federalist 10, I think. It's either 10 or 56 where Madison says a rage for paper money, right? Or the abrogation of debts or any other wicked scheme. You know, it's the reason our Constitution exists, in order to fix this flaw of too much democracy, and what will happen when you have too much democracy, too much representation, too much representative will of the majority, and not enough rights of the minority in the mix. And what is sad, and I think what you're detecting, is nobody's standing up for the rights of the minority part. Where's the conservative party? You know, who are the people who are supposed to be making this argument right now? And like I said, in the you know, when ignorance takes over, human nature will fill in that gap.
Well, we're not gonna end on that cut quote, Professor. So, Jake or Kate, Bart or James, or Ben, there's got to be a quick lightning round now. So, quick question, quick answer, and we'll call it victory in about 5 minutes. Bart.
My comment is not really it's not really a question, but I'm curious. I had never known I guess the words of Calvin Coolidge as much as I have in this in this podcast. So I find that very interesting. I mean, the only thing I knew about Calvin Coolidge before today was that some woman sat down next to him at a dinner and claimed she had bet somebody else that she could get him to talk. And he responded by saying, "You lose."
Right. Don't know if that actually happened, but it does sound like him. Yeah. No, the bet was that she could get him to say more than 3 words, and he just turned to her and said, "You lose." Yeah.
So I think that's great. You know, and I've actually kind of saved a couple of the documents we talked about today that you quoted in the chat, because I think it's interesting. You know, very thought-provoking, definitely. And you know, I think I got the wrong degree in college. I got a political science degree like John. I probably should have gotten a history degree, but hey, you know.
The other
Okay.
one I really love is the business and the free press, which is, you know, if you need more proof about how badly we've mangled the history of this country, know that people take this quote that they say, you know, Calvin Coolidge, business of America's business. I mean, have you ever heard that quote?
Yes.
It's literally from a speech about how about how easy it is to lie, and how you should understand the nature of truth. And in the middle of this, he describes how, yes, the business of America is business, but there are much more important things in life. And so what's funny is that in the speech about how easy it is to lie by taking things out of context, that quote of his has been taken out of context in order to lie about him.
That's funny.
Yeah.
We got to keep moving along. Thanks, Bart, and thanks, Professor. Jake, you ready to go? And then we have one more after Jake. Jake.
Yeah, so when we were talking about American exceptionalism, you talked about how it's the idea that America needs to be the city on a hill and prove to the world that, you know, representative government works, right?
Well, the city on the hill is taken from the John Winthrop. So
Yeah.
it was Reagan who actually, you know, put that together with American exceptionalism. But that's another document that is often taken out of context, because even that phrase is taken from John Winthrop's sermon on the Arabella, a model of Christian charity. But even in that context, it says, we shall be as a city on a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. But if you read the rest of it, it's all about what's going to happen to us if we fail. It's not, and it's that whole document itself is about the obligation. It's not, we're going to be better than everybody else. It's about, and again, very deeply Calvinist, written by a Puritan, you know, but again, it's not about arrogance. It's about how easy it is to fail, and that the eyes of all people are going to be upon us if we revert back to human nature instead of sticking to our principles.
Jake, did that get you, or do you want to finish your question?
Well, yeah, I wanted to kind of finish, but
Yeah.
Go ahead.
yeah. Well, no, so that idea that like we're better than everyone else, Joanne Freeman, the Yale historian who does like Hamilton and the early Republic, she despises the term American exceptionalism because as she tweets almost like quarterly, she thinks that it's a bad thing because her definition of American exceptionalism is we're special, we're American, therefore nothing bad can happen to us. And so that seems to be like the popular view of American exceptionalism that a lot of people say. Where does that idea start coming from?
A brief answer, Professor.
Woodrow Wilson, and he's totally wrong.
Well, that was brief. One more sentence.
Woodrow Wilson wanted to rewrite American history in order to remake America and the world in his image. And one of the things that he had to do was undo the American foreign policy tradition that said that we should only act out of a combination of our ideals and our interests, and that we should only act in accordance with his ideals. And because of that, the phrase American exceptionalism took on a new and more dangerous meaning, because then it became whatever we want to do is the right thing to do, instead of combining American foreign policy out of what had traditionally always been understood. I mean, John Quincy Adams also was fantastic on this, but that our foreign policy should always be based on and limited by only acting when in keeping with our ideals and our interests. But they were another group of people who've done a great job at rewriting American history and getting all these lies to be made almost permanent for 100 years.
All right, we're not going to end with that cut quote either. So
Well,
go ahead, Professor.
Well, I was just going to say, I think Jason Nelson had a question too. He unmuted himself.
Yeah, either Jason, Ben, or Kate. Last call. Got to be quick. Both Q and A.
Thank you for the Coolidge. I love the way that's so simple. I'm concerned about voting rights because how can we have consent of the governed if not only are we going backwards, or as you might describe it, or I would, reactionarily going backwards in terms of who can vote, but then also who counts the votes and who's in charge of determining the outcome of elections.
I was really concerned with something strange, the Supreme Court decision on the Arizona voting rights case. And I wasn't so much concerned about the majority opinion, which I believe was largely correct. I was really concerned with the logic behind the 3 dissents that said that they would have intervened and said that it was a violation of voting rights of minorities if you didn't have ballot harvesting. And I find that minority dissent deeply disturbing. Again, it seems strange to be concerned about a dissent, but I was really disturbed that we have 3 people on the Supreme Court who would have said that if you don't have ballot harvesting, that should give the federal government the right to overrule the voting procedures in a state.
And Professor, it's worthy of another topic for another day.
Sorry.
So thanks for the question, Jake and Stephen. Kate, if you have something burning, or Ben, please ask it, or otherwise we'll be done for today. You okay? Kate, quickly.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the first draft of the declaration, and I'm seeing under here a whole lot of like men should not be bought and sold. I'm gonna tangle things further if I actually ask my actual question. But what I was kind of seeing in this first draft, you had mentioned, Professor Tootle, that there was some wording about excluding slavery from the American proposition that was struck. And I'm kind of struggling to find evidence of that when he could just as easily have been talking about indenture of white people as he was talking about enslaved people.
So Kate and Professor, with your permission, we have an entire hour and a half next Friday set on this exact topic. And Professor Tootle is going to be discussing, maybe even debating with Professor Kerr. Oh, darn, I forgot it. Professor from Howard University for an hour and a half next Friday, same time. And so can you hold that question until next Friday?
Yeah, you bet. It'll give me a chance to read some more background.
Love it. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, Professor. Ben, last call.
Professor, you've done it again. You've proved 2 things for me. Number 1, that I know very little about history. And number 2, you've lighted a fire under me again for me to learn more. So thanks.
Thank you.
Love that. Now that may be a good way to finish. It's Professor Kerr Ritchie from Howard University, who's a PhD historian and will probably be Professor Tootle's match, which is just very exciting for all of us. So I'm going to end with this, and then Professor, you have the last word. I turned 55 this last week, and I'm as optimistic about our country as ever since I was 18 and first voted. I think there's a lot of problems in America, a ton of them, and I spent a lot of time trying to make them better. But I still feel a richness of the spirit that Abraham Lincoln gave a speech in Chicago, and he gave a bunch of speeches in Chicago, but a really famous one that just brings a tear to my eye on how much opportunity we have if we just kind of work hard to keep doing the right thing. And so I honor you for your willingness to kind of do an adult education thing on history. So hopefully other people see this in the future. Thank you for your time today. I'm going to be patriotic in a kind, thoughtful way, I hope, this 4th of July. And then on the 5th of July, I'm going to work harder to make sure our country's even better. That's my conclusion. What's yours, Professor?
I would just say the 4th of July is a time to think about the real definition of patriotism, which means to love these ideals. And every form of true love should be deeply imbued with obligation, not pride. And so we should approach these principles and think about how much we love them and what our obligation is to them. And then you will be showing your patriotism and your love of country.
Love that. What a great way to end. We'll go ahead and shut off the video, and we'll chat for another minute or two. If you need to leave, everyone, thank you. But we'll chat for just a minute or two after we're off video. Thanks. Great job, Professor.